topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Thanks for tuning in this week. Great to have you. I have been proudly hosting this show since February of 2018. So as of this recording, that's about 8.5 years. I am your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If we have not met yet, I'm a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, organizational logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Elise Cortez and Associates help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by articulating their purpose and building inspirational leaders and cultures activated by meaning and purpose to turn those companies from a flatline EKG to a vibrant destination workplace. There, people are intrinsically motivated to perform at their best, grow into their fuller potential, and are committed to stay and help deliver on the company's mission. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at elisecortez.com. Now, for today's program, with us is Dr. Robert Lengel, who began his career designing jet and rocket propulsion systems and meandered through fluid computer design and industrial sales, a stint on Wall Street, time in an environmental think tank, academics, consulting, and now writing. Today, he is Associate Professor Emeritus at the University of Texas at San Antonio and president of his consulting firm, Leaderwork, Inc. He's the author of a few books, the latest one being A Place for Tea, Giving Voice to the Tortoise in our Harebrained World, which we'll be talking about today. Bob, a very hearty welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for having me, Elise. Great to be here.
So very welcome. I love it when I get to inadvertently cross paths with people I wouldn't otherwise maybe meet, and then read their amazing books, cover to cover, this one being yours. Look at this beautiful thing you made. And then talk about them on air. I love that. So I'm happy to meet you and have you on. And as I mentioned, I thought that I would deviate a little bit from this usual program, which is really meant to be quite educational. I try to teach from the book, but also inspire. And I want to get into the spirit of your book, Bob. So first, and I'm just going to give that as a teaser to our listeners and viewers who have been listening to this for a while, and they're going to wonder, what are we going to do here? But before we get into that, I do want to talk about where this book came from. What urged you to write it? This is no small undertaking of what you did here.
No, it wasn't. I don't know where to start with this. I wrote this book during the COVID shutdown. And largely it was a time where my consulting work, which was mostly face-to-face, got shut down totally.
I can relate, yes.
Yeah, so I had a Facebook group from my last book, The Front Porch Revolution, and I posted to it daily with essays. And so after a year, I realized that over 400 pages of text written on various subjects that I haven't really played much with during my career. Most of my career focused on business environment because I was in a business school for 32 years. But my work, listening to the news and watching what was going on in the world when the whole world slowed down a little bit, really inspired me to think back to where I came from and what I was really trying to write as a life story. That's where the book came from. You know, I don't know. You know, I was thinking about Kierkegaard once said that life's lived forwards and understood backwards. And so this gave me a time to literally sit in a rocking chair and look back to the pieces that were the seeds for this book. And they go back. And the first thing that came to mind that when I was in junior high school, I did a book report on Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. And I don't know why it hit me at the time. I was kind of a young guy just trying to get a project out of the way in school. But the book has stayed with me my entire life, and I've reread it multiple times because it was a prophecy about a day that would come that we'd have a dystopian society where the spirit, and I know you're interested in meaning and purpose, but to me, that's all wrapped up in the spirit
Agreed.
of being alive.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way you control people, which is what that society was trying to do, that Bradbury wrote about, he gave us a recipe to do it. Keep people busy, which is a universal disease right now. I mean, just try to get 4 people together for a meeting for a couple hours and see how long it takes to schedule it. And the second thing, which was intriguing, was to eliminate front porches on houses.
Mm-hmm.
And that really bothered me because I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania where all the houses had big old front porches. And they were really the place where the community had a heartbeat. People would meet in those steps, share stories, everybody knew everybody. And then I reflected back to where I live today, or I did live until 3 years ago in a development, not a community here in San Antonio, where they build the houses without front porches. And all the places where we would meet and converse would be behind the houses, behind privacy fences. And those privacy fences and those conversation places behind houses are the inspiration for all my work. We don't meet in the commonplace anymore, where everybody has an equal opportunity to feel like they belong. So this book is about the fate of spirit in a busy world and the fate of our front porches.
Oh my gosh, Bob, so many things to talk about there. So one, of course, you do talk about that, all of that in your book, which I really appreciated. So I feel like I know you. I know who you are as a human being. And I love that when I can access my guests like that. So beautiful the way that you shared. 2, I think it's interesting. I also crafted books during the pandemic. We had time. I had time to sit and reflect, and it was a big, collective breath that we took across the whole world. So it's interesting to me. There's lots of things that we could talk about of what came out of that collective breath. So many changes and elevations in how people think and feel. Your notion of the front porch, and even the way you talk about where people meet and the lighting in which they do so, is fascinating, Bob. I really, really got so much out of that. So the idea too of the front porch, and you talk about abundance versus scarcity in those moments. And so I think it would be good for us, just like you do in the book, to let our listeners and viewers invite them in to sit with us on that front porch. Because as you say, there's a very different view from that front porch that affords very different perspectives and elicits very different conversations.
Yeah, it's not only just the perspective, but we change in those places.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, I talk about taking my executive MBA classes to Europe and going through the great cathedrals. When you walk into those buildings, you change. And they're very different than walking into the boxes that we put up overnight now in the big cities to do business. There's a utility to the places we build these days. And there's a beauty to the places those cathedrals represent. One thing about the cathedrals is they're all bigger than they need to be. They're all more artistically ornate than they need to be. Stained glass windows, statues, things that just cost money and take endless time to build. But they used to be more about who we were as beings and identity than the buildings today, which are more about utility. So I think the places are a very important part of this book. We change in those places.
I completely agree with that. And I liked what you also said when you were talking about these beautiful European buildings. You said they reflect that what they valued, which was beauty and legacy and magnificence, instead of what we see today, which is more about efficiency and practicality. I have to say, from that vantage point, just as a small aside pet peeve, like you're mourning the loss of the front porches. I'm mourning the loss of actual materials beyond aluminum siding for new homes. Could we please stop that? I know it's very practical, but could we please stop that?
Yeah. Well, the cathedrals, what they represent to me are things that are not necessary and impractical. And those tend to be the things that give human beings meaning. So what I did in my book is looked at the tension between the busy world where we're human doings and the front porch world where we're human beings. And when we're in conference rooms, we're surrounded by things that have been created by our heads. And we're all different. In fact, we value ourselves by our utility of how different are we? Can I be different than somebody else? And on front porches, especially when we're sitting there watching the sunrise or at night and looking at the night sky together, we're not different. We're all the same. And the voices that come out of the front porch, when we lose them, we're losing part of our humanity. And to me, when I look at meaning and purpose and what this program is about, I read Man's Search for Meaning when I was in junior high school also. And Viktor Frankl's idea of being able to almost create a place of beauty even in a concentration camp. You can do it in the worst places. And some of the people who I know out there in the workplace feel like they're imprisoned. And the real sad part about it to me is I find so many people who don't have dreams anymore about their work. They've been so enculturated in living in those boxes that are all about efficiency and practicality and not the things that are extra that make us different from animals. Does that make sense?
Yes. And so I talk about this in probably at least one of my books, and that what I've kind of come to on that notion, Bob, when you say lost their dreams for work, I think it's also across their whole entire lives. When I'm out speaking oftentimes about passion, inspiration, and purpose, at some point of my talk, usually fairly early on, I ask the crowd, what are you passionate about? And then I watch the responses as they try to conjure something in return. And I realize in that one moment, as I watch the sea of faces register, that they don't have an answer to the question. They don't know what they're passionate about. And that's when I know I'm needed.
Well, the other part of this, I go in classes, and the first thing I stand in front of a class, I ask them, what are your questions? And they stare back at me like that.
Yes, indeed. I loved, by the way, your section on asking beautiful questions and the humanity that comes with that. Before we get into that, I think it's important for our listeners and viewers who haven't yet read the book as I have, I think we need to introduce and distinguish the hare and the tortoise, if you would.
That was sort of a late tag on to what I was writing. I wanted to be creative. I'm so used to writing articles that go into scientific magazines, and my two previous books didn't have characters in them except for me. So the tortoise and the hare, the classic Aesop fable, was a story about the slow and steady winning the race in life. That the hare is fast and clever, and the tortoise is slow and steady. But at the end of the race, the tortoise wins. In my version, we're in a competition between our heads and how we think and our intellect and our hearts, which represent and carry our spirit of who we are as human beings. And we've evolved at two different levels. If you think about, I reflected in the book on the things that I experienced with technology. But if you go way back to the cave days and human beings, the tortoise and the hare had an opportunity to talk to each other. When we were creating something or building something, there was always a conversation. Okay, here's what we're going to do and how we do it, but also how we want to be doing it. Who are we trying to become as human beings? It was connected in the early days before all the technology came on. But as this race between the tortoise and the hare evolved, our heads have gone to the moon. I mean, we've gone into worlds of nanoseconds and megatons. But inside, as we are as human beings on the front porch, we haven't changed at all. Basically, we're the same people who have the fears about our own mortality, who worry about feelings and get hateful and anger and love. All those things are the same. But what happens when our heads get so far ahead of our hearts that we don't leave a place for a tortoise? And I named the tortoise T. So the book title is A Place for T, how to find a place in our harebrained world to give a place for T, give him a voice. And so if you think about the way we meet these days, it, tea isn't welcome in conference rooms because it takes time to talk about our feelings and our stories and all the things that tea would want to talk about that make us common. We just want to get down and be efficient, stick to an agenda, get to takeaways and move on. But what's coming really interesting, at least right now, is all the problems I hear people talking about relate to tortoise issues, hair issues, the things that about changing cultures, for example. That's a tortoise game. That's not a hair game. And we're trying to change cultures with our thinking and not our feeling. We're trying to change and move the furniture on the stage with our intellects, but the people, they don't change that fast. And so there's a very different approach to this. And I think you can change cultures in a couple of days if you give tea a voice. And if you don't, you're not going to change cultures, period.
You're speaking my love language, Bob. Be careful. You're going to get right into my heart. Let's let our listeners and viewers reflect on that while we grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Dr. Robert Lengel, who is the author of A Place for Tea, Giving Voice to the Tortoise in Our Harebrained World. We've been talking a bit about where this book came from and why it's important. After the break, we're going to get into one of his key concepts, which is the importance of divergent thinking. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. As I am also dedicated to helping to create a world where people realize their potential at work, and they're led by inspirational leaders that help them find and contribute their greatness, and we do business that betters the world, I keep researching and writing my own books. So one of my latest books, which came out in March of 23, is called The Great Revitalization, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business, which helps leaders understand what today's workforce wants, and then offers 21 best practices to equip them to provide it through their leadership and culture. You can learn more about my books and how to work with me at elisecortez.com, and you can check out Amazon as well for them. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Dr. Robert Lengel, who is the Associate Professor Emeritus at the University of Texas at San Antonio and president of his consulting firm, Leader Work, Inc. He's the author of A Place for Tea, Giving Voice to the Tortoise in Our Harebrained World. So I hope our listeners and viewers got a chance to be able to settle into themselves as I continue to do as I read your book and have a conversation with you. Because next I want to situate one of the most key concepts in your book, at least from what I could tell, and that's the notion of developing divergent thinking. So if you could talk a little bit about what is divergent thinking and why is it important?
Well, there are a number of ways I could approach this, and maybe I'll approach it with the tortoise and hare.
Sounds good.
The tortoise, the book is about the fate of spirit. And I do something interesting, Elise, at the beginning of almost every program and every class I run. And that is to give people journals, sit them in a circle, and ask them to make two lists. One list is the things that give them spirit in their work. And the second list is things that kill it or diminish it.
Yeah.
And I've done this in hundreds and hundreds of groups, all the way from high school students to senior teams in Washington. And I always get the same results. The things that give people spirit, they all know it gives them spirit. And meaning is part of it. Doing something that's bigger than themselves.
Yes.
Having a voice, being respected, being trusted, having a healthy culture that's safe. I could go on and on. but everybody knows what gives them spirit, and they all agree to it no matter what they're doing. When I go to the kill spirit side, bureaucratic red tape and nonsensical rules, things that make them feel like they're in a straitjacket and can't be themselves, an unsafe environment, lack of voice, work that seems meaningless and purposeless, and you could go on and on. And after, what I do is go around the circle and have each person give one thing on each list. And I have a graphic recorder that works with me, and I have 2 walls filled with paper.
Mm.
And I list those things. So they sit between these walls of spirit and no spirit. And the question I ask them next is, which wall represents your workplace? And I've
Wow.
never had any workplace tell me it wasn't the no spirit wall. It's universal. And then the question that starts my program is, well, if we all agree what spirit is and we all agree we want to be in spirit, why do we collaborate to create environments that leave us without spirit? And so that's the entry to this. The tortoise carries the spirit, and the hare carries the thinking about the spirit. And so if you have things at the spirit level like trust, convergent thinking, which is the opposite of divergent thinking, takes trust, and to create it in words where we can think about it, it becomes contracts. And so we live in contracts, and the spirit of trust disappears. You take morality, and the spirit of morality and those values, when they get intellectualized in the harebrained thinking, they become laws. And so we live in the spirit, we live in the letter of the law, and we lose the spirit of the morality behind it. And you could go on and on. Organizations are living cultures, but when the harebrain starts to think about it, we reduce them convergently to org charts and job descriptions. And that's what we do to human beings too. Whole human beings at the tortoise level. When we think about them at the harebrain level, we reduce them to job descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody asks you who you are, I'm vice president of finance, I'm not so-and-so. So our resume is written by our harebrains, and our legacies are written by the tortoise. And we don't have any time anymore to put time into the legacy stories. That's the story in the book. Divergent thinking takes us from the contracts back to trust. It takes us from the laws back to the spirit behind the laws of the morality, and from the org charts back to the culture. And so you can go on, and from the job description back to the human being. I take that vice president out of the conference room, put him around a campfire by a lake, and that human being comes to life.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about lighting these spaces. After I do that spirit, no spirit check-in, it's so fascinating that the next conversation is about candlelight and flashlight.
Mm-hmm.
These are sophisticated people with multiple degrees. And now I'm introducing them to candlelight and flashlight conversation. And I asked them to list in their journals the qualities of candlelight and the qualities of flashlight. And when they finish that exercise, I put those on the opposite walls too. And the spirit lines up with candlelight. Candlelight is soft, it's inviting, it's eternal, it's mysterious. It's all the things that capture the spirit of human beings. The flashlight is distant, it's cold, it's technical. The flashlight represents the lighting in the conference room. That candlelight represents the lighting on the evening skies sitting on the front porch. And the tortoise carries the candlelight, and the hare uses flashlight to see the world. And if the tortoise moves too fast, the flame blows out. But what's interesting, when we're almost so much about change these days, that the change, when the biggest moments of change in our lives are when involve our mortality. The loss of a loved one is a huge change.
Yes.
The shooting at, the horrors like the shooting at Uvalde, which is only about 30 or 40 miles from here in San Antonio, that was a horror. And what's interesting to me at the days after it, and I think of 9/11, and I remember the days right after 9/11 that stopped the world, and we stopped flying, and everything slowed down, and people started to think differently. How did they meet? They didn't meet in conference rooms. They met around music and poetry and candlelight,
Yes.
and which is how what the tortoise brings into our lives. If we want big change and we want to change ourselves, we look better in candlelight to each other.
I definitely am going to be requesting candlelight for my next date for sure, because you said I look better in candlelight. So I'm gonna set that up. Thanks, Bob.
Who has romantic flashlight dinners?
I don't know, or even just horrible regular artificial light dinners. Thank you very much. So what is wonderful about this conversation, and why I am so delighted to have you on this program, Bob, is I think that the work that you're putting forth is exactly what's necessary to be able to take the world of work where it needs to go next. We have an opportunity right now, not just after COVID and the pandemic, and what gave people the opportunity to pause their lives and consider, what do I really want from my life and my work? What am I willing to tolerate and not tolerate, and how much am I willing to accept for pay to do all that? Everybody, there was a lot of consideration for that. And now the workforce, we have an empowered workforce that is really leading the charge here. And now what we're finding, of course, is leaders are reeling and trying to figure out, well, how do I address this? What do I do here? It's a perfect opportunity to reinvent how work gets done, where it gets done, and how we do it together. And that's definitely a big part of the work that I'm out to do in the world. So learning from someone like you and adding those ideas into what I keep learning each week is just critical. So I see your work as a way to help us create the healthy path to restore us back to humanity, back to a wholeness in ourselves. So I want to talk a little bit about how some of these concepts, because I know some of these people that are listening to the show is like, this is all amazing, and what do I do with this? I know, of course, we want the tortoise to get them to think and let it work through their minds, hearts, and souls. And let's help them connect the dots just a little.
Yeah, I presented in the book a cloud also, and that is that when the tortoise and the hare, at the beginning of our evolution, they were together and talked together. But when the hare adapted technology to aid its thinking, things started to speed up and getting more complex. Mm-hmm. And the hare still took care of the tortoise, because we created with our thoughts structures that slowed the world down so we could still be in them. That's the root of bureaucracy. That's the root of structures. That's the root of rituals and traditions and culture.
Fascinating.
We thought about how we could slow the world down so the tortoise could still breathe and be part of the conversation. But I'll tell you what, I talk in the book about it, the technology being a little tiger cub. And when we adapted it early on, it was cute and cuddly. But we've been feeding it, and it's been growing. And it's growing to the point now where I want to put a question mark over all this, is whether or not the tiger wants to be in this race anymore. And that's the birth of artificial intelligence and what's happening. All the structures in economic theory are best in economic theory, that we don't have time during the day to talk about everything. So we substitute things like authority and structures that slow things down, and human beings are only capable of processing very small amounts of information when it comes right down to it. Do you know what the random access memory of the human brain is?
No.
I'm sitting in my office here. I have a computer on my credenza that my parents gave me when I was a junior in high school. Think about that.
Does the thing still run?
Yeah, but it's not anything like a computer you would recognize. It's just a bunch of wires and relays and switches.
Okay.
The random access memory was 28 bits, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Mm-hmm.
The random access memory in my smartphone, I can get gigabytes. And we talk terabytes. We don't even know what that means anymore.
No.
But the random access memory of the human brain, what we can hold in consciousness in a moment, is about 7 bits. And in order to think about those bits, we have to boot what we were thinking about. So we can't capture ourselves, Elise, by thinking about it. And that's why we work, and that's why purpose is so important, because we work to take the candle flame, I think, is a mirror of our consciousness. That's why it's so mysterious to us, because we can't catch that either. But why do people sculpt or write books? Why do they want to see themselves in their work? Because they can't see themselves in their consciousness. So they want something that has some temporal stability to it. So the whole idea of purpose, people are inspired to work if they can see themselves and learn about themselves in the process. But too often we've created structures that have gone extreme to try to control people to do precisely what we want them to do, and we value them for your utility and not for their uniqueness. So I just wanted to get that in, because I think what's happening now is the way computers are going, their capacities, and we're going to have biological computers and quantum computers coming right up on the horizon. And with artificial intelligence, it is just a matter of time before those machines develop a consciousness. And I've been writing invited articles about my book that are all related to artificial intelligence now, because they invalidate the assumptions upon which all structures have been thought through with our harebrains. We don't need them anymore.
Oh my gosh.
I think the challenge, at least is this work on meaning and purpose, is fighting a bigger uphill battle. And in the background is a shadow of whether or not the human species will have a purpose and a meaning, and we're all part of that species. I don't know. I just like to keep that in the background, because it makes for creative thinking to think about that, because it's not just about us individually anymore, but we're fighting an uphill battle to keep afloat.
All right, let's let our listeners think about that as well. Let's give them some time, some tea time, shall we, Bob, as we take our last break here. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Dr. Robert Lengel, who's the author of A Place for Tea, Giving Voice to the Tortoise in Our Harebrained World. We've been talking a little bit about some of the concepts he discusses in the book, the importance of divergent thinking, the importance of coming back to where we have stillness, and how we decide where we're meeting, what kind of light do we use in those meetings. After the break, we're going to get into some comparison and thinking and contrast into how what we look through, which pairs of glasses, the hair glasses or the tea glasses, what they actually illuminate. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us, and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. I mentioned to you in the last break that I have my latest book is called The Great Revitalization. It is for leaders and for business and for culture. So what I did to accompany that is I created a short 3-page assessment. And it's there on my website for you to be able to download. It's free. You can go to elisecortez.com and then go to How Do We Help tab, and you'll find it there. If you're just now joining us, my guest is Dr. Robert Lengel. He's the Associate Professor Emeritus at the University of Texas at San Antonio, the president of his consulting firm, Leaderwork Inc., and the author of A Place for Tea, Giving Voice to the Tortoise in Our Harebrained World. So for this last bit here, Bob, I think it would be amusing, entertaining, and also uplifting to be able just to compare and contrast a little bit what it looks like when we have hair glasses on versus tortoise glasses. Where shall we start?
Ambiguity?
I love it. Okay.
No, my first two college degrees were in aerospace engineering, and you talk about harebrained world and being, but everything was, the idea was to be precise, and the idea of communications was always to make sure that whatever message you're sending is received in an objective sense. Think about how we teach managers in MBA programs. Communication. I don't want to communicate to a bunch of people and have any ambiguity about it if I'm trying to give directions. But there's a whole part of organization that is silent if we do that. And I think that there's a chapter in there called T-risk, where it's the risk of what's not being said and not being heard in organizations. And often that's the T voice that speaks with the value of ambiguity. I think about intelligence at three levels. And my co-author would hate me to go into this. She hates when I do it, but I love it. When, there's three kinds of intelligence we're playing with here. It's the intelligence on the mountaintop that has no frame and everything's just there without thinking. That's a spiritual intelligence. When we come off the mountaintop, we pick up binoculars, and we essentially have a choice as to where we point those binoculars. Those are our questions. So the kinds of questions we ask determine the kind of world we see. And if we ask convergent questions that seek answers, we bring our world down to be something smaller. If we ask what you call beautiful questions, we open up the world to something that's better. Well, the things that appear on that middle stage are about aesthetics. The choice as to where to point those isn't information-based, it's aesthetic-based. What do we find attractive or beautiful? And when we point the binoculars in that direction, the next thing we do is we bring in the harebrain, and that little central control we turn to get the picture to be absolutely clear and precise. So we take the trust that's beautiful and we reduce it to something that's very clear in contracts. And that's how we do it. But when we think of vision statements and inviting people to be part of something when we communicate, the ambiguity is critically important. And the story I tell in the book is a story about my grandfather when we lived in a small town in Pennsylvania when I grew up, and my grandfather had one of the very first TV sets. And that thing, he'd sit in the living room, and it had rabbit ear antennas. Most of your younger listeners probably don't even know what they are. But we only had so many shows on, and most of the time was just a test pattern. But when a show did come on, like on a Sunday night, he would tune those rabbit ears till we got a clear picture. And then the rest of my family would sit around there mesmerized by the magic of what was coming on that screen. But he disappeared into the kitchen, turn off the lights, and listen to radio dramas. In the old days, there were a lot of interesting things on the radio that people paid attention to, and he was used to that. And as a young kid, I walked in and said, "Why don't you come in and watch the pictures? They're so beautiful and so clear." And he said, "I think the pictures on the radio are clearer to me than they are on the TV." And I took that to heart because I said, "What are you talking about? There's the TV leaves nothing to the imagination." His pictures were clearer because his imagination created them.
Yes.
He could create the characters and setting and the place. And books are one step past that, where they invite the imagination. They invite the reader, the listener, to be part of something, not separate from it. And to me, that's what poetry is, and the arts is they leave holes. They're a language with holes in it, where it invites us, RT, to get into that picture and be part of it. So it's not the objective communication that we want, but it's the subjective space we want people to be in. I was part of a team at the university a number of years ago where they were trying to write a vision statement. I always hate being invited to those groups because you get 8 academics trying to write a paragraph in a degree too. And we wound up with these uninspiring vision statements that were almost a page long with footnotes. That's what academics do. And we were frustrated. We'd been going on months for this and we couldn't come down to it. And one day at a meeting that we were just about ready to throw it in, the door opened And one of our vice presidents walked in with a guest. That guest was Maya Angelou.
Oh my gosh.
And
Oh yes, you do talk about this.
she had friends in San Antonio, often came down and walked the Riverwalk. And so she came out to the university, and she knew about the university. And she looked at us and said, "What are you all doing?" We're writing a vision statement. And then she's asked, "How's it going?" And we all had to break up because it wasn't going very well at all. She said, "Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but keep up the good work." And then she started to walk out. And one of my colleagues asked her, "Miss Angelou, what do you think the vision is for this university?" Now, you got to understand that we live in a multicultural community down here. Almost 50% of the population or more is Hispanic. And we lived in this culture all the time, and a lot of first-time people going to school. So we weren't getting the traditional student that most schools do. And nobody knew about us. We were a new school. When I came to UTSA in 1982, there were 5,000 students. Now there are 35,000. It's hard to even recognize. Maya, without skipping a beat, said, "I think you're a rainbow in the clouds." And she left. And that was beautiful. That's what we were, a rainbow of colors, but people couldn't see us because we were in the cloud. Unfortunately, our harebrains got to work on that. And by the time we were finished with it, it became 2 paragraphs that we published in the graduate catalog, and nobody saw the rainbow in the clouds. So I think ambiguity is such an important tool. Is don't make vision statements clear. Make them ambiguous with holes in them so people can get inside of them and be part of it, like the radio program, not the TV.
And be inspired by them. Be enlarged by them. Yes. Oh my goodness, that was ambiguity versus T's precision. Yes, indeed. I would love for us, if we can, to distinguish the hair glasses of motivation versus the T glasses of inspiration. I have to ask about that.
Well, the harebrained world creates external structures that invite actions through incentives. And that's pretty much what I call management work, and where incentives are used to motivate people.
Right.
The tortoise lights the fire inside, and it lights the candle flame in our bellies. And so that's leaders inspire. They get people to act through inspiration. And it's interesting because I think inspiration requires that we have places where we can be ourselves completely and experiment to find out who we might become. And the incentives sometimes drive that away. So if you think about it, the pay, when we're paid to do something, the pay is compensation for a piece of our tea place. And so the more you get paid, quite often, the more they're buying of your inspiration. And so sometimes the place where we have the most inspired people are places where they don't get paid at all, where they're working for Habitat for Humanity, or the project I had at UTSA where the kids worked for pediatric cancer families. No pay. It's all about an invitation to service, to open up. And that's the difference, I think, between the inspiration and the leader work and the motivation, which is management work. And the reason leadership is a huge challenge, I've done research to look at the effects of leadership programs in organizations. And the top level, the C-suite people, want to change their organization. That's why they're investing in leadership. But the programs that focus on individual leaders have not led to organizational impacts. And they're almost universally dissatisfying to the people who are investing in them. And so we're leaving no place. They can go out and inspire their tea at a beautiful program. And some of the programs on leadership for individuals are incredible. They're inspiring, they're well received, they're well evaluated. But if they come back to an organization that is all external harebrained and they have no place to practice that, it sometimes is actually a negative. Because I'm inspired to do all this and I try it and my boss won't let me do it, or there's no place to do it.
By the way, Bob, what's fascinating about what you said earlier about the three kinds of intelligence, that aligns extremely well with the last three chapters of my book, The Great Revitalization, where I put forth those 21 best practices and I organize them around intellectual quotient intelligence, IQ intelligence, logical, rational, EQ, emotional intelligence kind of issues, caring, aesthetic qualities, and spiritual intelligence. It's so what you're talking about in different parlance has very much aligned and found its way into my heart, my mind, and my work.
That, by the way, is one of the things that was really inspiring to me when I thought about my work during the COVID shutdown. And that is that the dissonance. We had people during the shutdown was the 2020 election. And there were fights in grocery stores, people putting up their political signs, neighbors who couldn't talk to each other anymore, the hate-filled rhetoric we're seeing in Washington, all that stuff drove me that there's got to be something better. And so there's an analysis of dissonance in the book, that it comes at two levels. The dissonance we normally think about is intellectual dissonance, but there's also an aesthetic dissonance about what we like or don't like that has nothing to do with information or truth or logic. And for example, there's no truth in the color blue. And you like red and I like blue. If we argue about that, we go nowhere. On the other hand, it's a language thing. If we differ about something like gun control, where you're in favor of gun rights and gun unlimited, and you live in Texas after all, you have to be. And on the other side, you want total gun control. We'll argue with our hairbrains till we don't like each other anymore. And we'll live with separate silos for the rest of our lives. But if I show you an ambiguous painting or an ambiguous poem or an ambiguous piece of music, you might like it or not like it, but it's not true one way or the other. But we won't disagree because beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The language of the arts, the ambiguous languages, are open and accepting of diversity naturally without emotion. So what I do in creating meeting places where there's a lot of disagreement is I don't work in Hare's intellectual language at all. I go almost immediately to image or music or poetry. But people understand the likes and dislikes. You might almost agree with me, but not like the way I say it. And that'll create dissonance, so you won't listen to me.
Oh, Bob, I hate to give you up. This is so beautiful. And yet we found our way to the end of the show. And everything that you have said, I've, as you can see, I'm hanging on your words. You know, this show is listened to by people around the world that are interested in improving their experience of work and changing and elevating the way that we actually lead people. What would you like to leave them with today?
I think I don't have 5 bullet points. The book isn't like that. I can leave them with 2 things that have been ringing in my ears my entire life. One is a quote I've created for my own old website. The only real tragedy in life is to have something special inside of you the world will never see. That's one. And the other one is don't sell your dreams for a salary. We've somehow we've become slaves to an economic engine that we have to feed more and more. And I know people who believe they don't have a choice but to do things that are economically practical, that they have a choice to go down and pay more for gas because the person who owns that station donates to the food bank. So harebrained thinking is essentially on a thinking of scarcity, and that's economics. And the tortoise is more into the humanities and the arts.
Beautiful way to finish, Bob. I'm very, very grateful to know you, to have read your book, to share with my listeners and viewers, and I look forward to staying in touch and sitting on the front porch with you, and under candlelight if we can, or in candlelight if we can.
You have an open invitation. You're not that far away.
Thank you. Take it up. All right, listeners and viewers, if you want to learn more about Bob, his work at Leader Work Inc., or his books, you can just start by going aplaceforT.com. So that's aplaceforT, the letter T.com. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. We were on the air with Heather McGowan and Chris Shipley talking about their new book, The Empathy Advantage, Leading the Empowered Workforce, which I found to be incredibly illuminating of today's workforce wants and needs and what leaders need to be and do to attract, motivate, and retain them. Their message actually very much aligns with mine in my latest book, The Great Revitalization, as well. Next week, we'll be on the air with Atiq Rafiq talking about his book, Decision Sprint, the new way to innovate into the unknown and move from strategy to action. I've been reading this book for the last couple of weeks. It's actually very intense and extremely accessible. We'll be talking about it then next week. Remember that work is an integral and important part of our lives and can be one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.